Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcast.
This is part 3 of the series that we've been doing on the Indy strategy debate. We started off looking at the Indy strategy that came out of the SNP conference. Part 2, we were talking to some SNP members about what their feelings and thoughts were from it. And now we're going to be talking to people who are in other Indy supporting parties.
We have Colin Fox from Scottish Socialist Party, Julie McAnulty from the Independence for Scotland Party, ISP, and we have Dave Thompson, who is a member of Alba, but tonight he's talking to us on behalf of Christians for Independence. Before we speak to our guests, we have 2 short clips, one of Patrick Harvie from the Greens conference describing his response to the SNP strategy, and the other, Alex Salmond from the Alba conference, also describing his thoughts on the strategy.
We share a common hunger for Scotland to be able to chart its own future, but ours is a different vision of independence to that of the SNP's. More radical, more decentralised, more eager to use the levers that independence gives us to achieve that greener and fairer Scotland. And so much of what's happened since 2014 has made this more urgent. Brexit, right-wing populism, the lurch of Labour to the right, ditching its principles at breakneck speed. All of this amplifies the urgency of being able to choose our own path forward. But I do share the frustration that too much time has been spent on discussing the how of independence, the questions of process, when we should be talking about why. Because here and now our Parliament is already under threat. Time and again, over the last year, the Tories have lain waste to the idea of the Union as a partnership of equals, blocking long-awaited gender reform, destroying recycling ambitions, and cheerleading from the Scotland office in the shape of Alistair Jack as he tramples over devolution with all of the finesse of a toddler on a sugar rush.
Alba stand for Scottish independence. Every vote for Alba at each and every election is a vote for independence. And if a majority of votes is cast in any election in that direction, then the Scottish Government is mandated to negotiate independence. If Westminster says no, then we should mobilise domestic and international opinion to force them to respect the democratic wishes of the sovereign Scottish people.
We're going to kick off the first section, just asking our guests for their thoughts on what the SNP came up with.
And the first speaker will be Colin Fox, followed by Julie McAnulty and Dave Thompson.
Well, I welcomed it. I mean, I think there's a great deal of thought has got to get into. We've got some fairly profound challenges in front of us, how we're going to get independence, how we're going to get a majority for independence, how we're going to overcome the obstacles that are put in our way. So whatever contributions to that debate that are offered, then I think we're all duty bound to listen, to hear, to learn, swap ideas. I didn't find it particularly persuasive, but not unwelcome because of that. The more people are thinking about this, the more likely we're going to come up with some solutions. So it's another one of these process discussions, but the process, while it's not the be-all and end-all, I still think the most important question is how we're going to get a majority. But once we get that majority, then this process of how we're going to secure independence is an extremely important debate. And you don't often get many brownie points for leaving considerations like that way down the track. You've got to have them in the forefront of your mind all the time. So I'm interested in it. I'm a partisan, and as much as the Scottish Socialist Party's been in favour of independence now for 25 years, which means we've not had it yet, so we're as impatient as anybody else. So I think those discussions, to be honest with you, Marlene and Fiona, they've been few and far between actually.
It's really just more of the same. It's an endless Groundhog Day, and it's like they're almost afraid to even mention the word independence. We're just going round and round in circles. We're going up against Section 30, coming back. Oh, they won't allow us to do this, they won't allow us to do that. Of course, Westminster aren't going to allow us to do anything. We have to do things that are disallowed by them. This is actually the only credible way forward, to be honest with you. They need to stop with Section 30 and stuff like that. They're never going to offer us another referendum, especially given that we're running at 50%, at least publicly in the polls. It's probably more.
I'm very interested in keeping an eye on where the SNP are. The SNP are still by far the biggest and most important parliamentary force for independence, and I hope the SNP do well. When you look at what they've proposed for the route to independence, our reaction in CFI is very much that it's awfully wide and open to interpretation, and there are all sorts of avenues that can be opened.
What is the answer to the problem? They want a second referendum in Westminster. Have told us you're not going to get it. So how are we going to get it? And I think we should be clear. If we're heading for a Labour government next year, Labour are as unionist as the Tories. Labour are as opposed to Scottish independence as anybody else in these aisles. And I can say I was a member of the Labour Party for the first 10 years of my political life, when I was a novice, when I was an adolescent, when I didn't know any better. We have to make Westminster an offer they can't refuse. We need to have majority support, and we say we have the majority, we speak on the behalf of the majority, and what follows is that we're entitled to mobilise that majority both through Parliament and through extra parliamentary activities. I say that because I was also one of the veterans of the anti-poll tax campaign. The greatest civil disobedience in recent years resulted in a success.
Now, what CFI are proposing isn't that we hold any de facto referendums. We are proposing that every single UK Scottish general election is a vote for independence, not a referendum, but a vote for independence, because there will be other things in the manifestos. And the parties that win will also be arguing on the other issues. And if they're clever, independence will be top and centre, and everything else will be, this could be much better under independence. I think, to be fair to the SNP, the policy of using a majority of seats has got a certain logic to it, because that's the way the UK works. And in some ways it's maybe got a bit of cleverness to it, in the sense that it allows the SNP, when they get their majority of seats, to say, well, look, we've stood on the normal basis. The Westminster Parliament are the gold standard for democracy across the whole world, aren't they? You know, therefore, if we comply with their gold standard, how can they in all conscience ignore us? Now, we know they will ignore. There's a certain logic in pushing that, because you challenge them. But let's say Starmer gets 44% of the vote, but a huge landslide. Then he's got it on a minority vote, and he's won on seats. So you can use that to put pressure on them. I don't think it would work, but again, it adds a bit of grist to the mill.
Topic 2 was, how do we build support for independence?
The cost of living crisis, that issue pertains to what kind of country do you want to live in. It's about change. And running through the sort of independence debate, like that Stock of Rock, famously, you know, Millport running through the middle of the Stock of Rock, is the question that we, all of us in the independence movement, have got to address, which is independence about change or is it not? And how much change is it about? Because I think I would say to you, I've debated with people, for example, Mike Russell for the SNP. I remember a meeting in Grangemouth about, I don't know, a year ago, something like that. And Mike at that stage was arguing this was the start of the Indy Ref 2 campaign. But his basic premise was, no, independence won't mean much change. We'll keep the Queen, we'll keep the pound. And I was saying, Mike, that's the antithesis of what people want to hear. They want to hear independence is about profound change. It's going to change the hideous inequalities in Scotland that sees a third of our kids in Glasgow going to bed every night hungry. It's about addressing the hideous housing problem. How do people under 50 get their own house now? I mean, the average house price in Edinburgh is soaring towards 350, 400,000. If you're earning £20,000, £25,000 a year, how does that work? Where are you going to get a mortgage for 15 or 20 times your salary, floundering around in the private rental market, paying a fortune for a squalid tenement flat. So there's these profound questions, and independence either changes that or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, we never win.
Political parties are needed, but they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Really, what we need is a proper people's movement on this now. And I think the way forward is probably through the likes of Salvo, which is going just now. That is very much what you're pushing.
Is there not also a step where you're going to have to show that, okay, the people are sovereign, but you still have to know that it's the majority of the people that agree with you? So is there not a point during that process where you have to have something that's a referendum or some kind of vote?
We don't require 10,000 signatures for a start, okay? We just need to register ourselves as a sort of liberty group with the UN and proceed from there and put forward our case.
The policy that we've adopted within CFI just this week, our preferred route to independence, basically sets out 6 points. The first point is that we are not going to get another referendum. The UK establishment has set its face against that. Now, in politics, nothing's impossible. It's also very, very clear that after the Supreme Court judgment of about a year ago, that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power itself under current UK law, without a Section 30 order, to hold a referendum. There is a way through that, of course, and the Scottish Parliament could dissolve and run a Scottish election at any time, but that's not going to happen. Well, the only legitimate democratic means of getting Scottish independence is to use the current democracy of the UK. UK general elections and Scottish general elections. And the criteria for winning them is winning the greatest number of seats. But you have to go into them with a very, very clear mandate. Political parties put independence at the top of their manifesto at the next UK general election, which will be held probably sometime next year, or the following Scottish election, or the following UK election, or the following Scottish election, and we have that as the top thing until we get our independence. We also believe that we need a majority of votes. We don't think a majority of seats would be sufficient. I think we have to win a majority of votes. Now, that's all the votes for all the parties that put independence as their number one item in their manifesto. That would be acceptable, I'm quite sure, internationally. And I would hope in such an election we wouldn't just get 50% plus one. I think the focus on Indy would take us up to 55 or 60% and put the whole thing absolutely beyond doubt.
But I support the idea of a single referendum, a single question, answer it straight. Let us, be a black and white choice, not wrapping it up in a general election, which is wrapped in Trident and cost of living crisis and Gaza and Ukraine and climate change and this. A single question with profound implications, and you take the decision. That was right. I supported that in 2014 when we had it. Because we've got to get a majority that supports it, and if we get a majority, it unlocks the key to every other obstacle that's put in our way.
The SNP need to up the ante. I think they need to come out of Westminster. I think they need to remove their MPs because we are just, as we see it, participating in their own gaslighting under the illusion that what we actually have to contribute there means anything, does anything for Scotland. It doesn't. And it's just perpetuating the myth that we actually have any say in what's happening up here in Scotland. What's happened with Grangemouth, if anyone was in any doubt who's in control, has illustrated that absolutely perfectly. We are sitting in the middle of an oil-producing country, being told by someone who owns the refinery and not the state what we're going to do about the most crucial part of our economy. I mean, I would expect a ruling party at the moment, which the SNP is, to be calling Jim Ratcliffe's bluff and saying, OK, we'll buy you out, and if we can't buy you out, we're going to build another refinery, and see how you like that.
Now, the way that you achieve that is if you can get unity of all the political parties that are going to stand, and the Yes movement, the wider Yes movement, everybody who wants independence. So if everybody united behind that policy, put it in their manifestos, and everyone campaigned together on that basis, then I'm pretty sure we would win and move towards independence.
In a sense, it's not important whether it's 50 or 40. You're quite right. We need 60%.
Yeah.
We need 60% because we don't want a result that says, well, best of three. You won the first one narrowly, we won the second one narrowly. No, it needs to be a decisive. That question and that issue reduces itself to, so how do we persuade the majority of people that independence is going to make them better off economically, politically, socially, and culturally? That's always been the question that we faced. And in my view, it's always been the question we've failed. And I respond to that as my grandmother and grandfather. You roll up your sleeves and you do the job better the next time. If the case isn't persuasive, then you work to make it more persuasive. And you don't think you can somehow wheedle 45% will become 60 by some dialectical extrapolation that Lenin might have referred to, whatever. We need to get a majority. And my feeling is it's there. It's possible to get a majority. We need to present a better case than we've done so far. People don't believe in our economic case. They just think that, oh, you're just going to have the same inequalities in Edinburgh. You're going to have the same rich so-and-sos that have big power and finance capital, who treat people at their work miserably. The same powers that will be in charge. And unless we get rid of it, unless that's what independence is about, then I'm not buying into it. In other words, there has to be a profound shift in the way Scotland's wealth is currently distributed as well as created, and it has to mean that those who get insufficient share just now are catered for. So to give you one example, during COVID and right after COVID, the Scottish Socialist Party's principal campaign was for a national care service in Scotland, because we'd seen broken-heartedly so many people of our senior citizens had died in care homes. They didn't have the attention, the care that they deserved. Those care homes were exposed, in my view, as being utterly inadequate, not just for a pandemic, but for the life that they were supposed to provide people. And so the call for a national care service, which had widespread support, not just for the Scottish Socialist Party, but it was predicated on the idea that it was genuinely a comparator to the National Health Service, and that it was going to be free at the point of need, paid for out of general taxation, and its standards of care provided that were befitting of the 21st century. And the debate somehow got paralysed and sidetracked. I mean, I heard Nicola Sturgeon saying, we want a national care service like the National Health Service.
Yeah.
I mean, delved into it. He was offering no such thing. No such thing. It would still cost you £110,000 a year for your care. So that's wrapped up in independence. It's got to be a question of saying independence has got to be about a national care service, a national health service that's fit for the 21st century and holds to the prescription that Nair and Bevan laid out in 1947, that this would be publicly owned. Edinburgh's got 2 of our NHS hospitals that are privately owned. The Royal Infirmary is owned by a PFI. The Sick Kids is owned by a company from Australia. Public ownership is a big mainstay of why people support independence.
Question 3. Would you support a constitutional convention?
I've mentioned Salvo a couple of times, Fiona. So, I mean, basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to restore what was called the Convention of the Estates. And so it's basically the kind of same idea. I get the feeling that the SNP are kind of desperate at the moment, and they're just throwing out different ideas to see what will stick and what will not. But there isn't really a plan with it. Salvo has a very particular plan of both stating Scotland's constitutional rights, restoring them, and then that's basically our way around Section 30 and all the rest of it, getting international approval to pursue independence or whatever we choose as a properly recognised nation state. And I think that's a far more positive thing, and I would like to see other parties participating in that. The thing about Salvo is it is cross-party, and there are people in it from the SNP, from Alba, ourselves, and others that are pursuing this. So it's a real cross-party initiative, and I think it's the one that has the best chance of success for us at the moment, really.
We set up a constitutional convention or similar body, whatever you want to call it, but a body that would be set up basically to reaffirm the principle that the sovereignty of Scotland lies with the people. So this body would represent the people of Scotland, so it would include Civic Scotland, it would include members of the public, the wider Yes movement, and the political parties. So you'd have a very broad-based convention, and that body would begin the work of moving towards not independence itself, but initially in laying the foundation for Scotland's right to choose. And the reason we've gone down that road on CFI is that it will allow bodies, hopefully, and people, hopefully, maybe even some parties, hopefully, to come on board who don't necessarily favour independence, but who favour democracy, the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future. That line would allow us to hopefully involve a much wider group of people.
I can understand that. Well, it's a good thing to do, isn't it? To draw people in so that you can have that discussion. It might even draw in political parties that aren't pro-independence but are pro-democracy. That, I mean, in a way, that would in itself just be a refreshing outcome.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, we've had the Scottish Independence Convention. We obviously had the Yes movement, and I think there's an appreciation that, you know, we're stronger united, we're stronger together. The SNP can't do this on their own. I wouldn't suggest to you the Scottish Socialist Party can do it on its own, and that's probably widely understood and easily seen. But the same applies to the SNP. Yeah. The SNP can't do this on their own. They have to reach out. And I would say, in all candour, they've not done sufficient reaching out since 2015, when they got all these MPs elected. I find sometimes their attitude towards the rest of us, or in the independence movement outside the SNP, rather dismissive, rather haughty. Well, you don't have representatives in Parliament, so your point of view is not worthwhile. And they have to sometimes be brought back down. You know what they say, pride cometh before a fall. And I fear the SNP are going to lose half their seats in Scotland next year. I hope it leads to a regard that says, we know now we can't do it on our own.
Basically, what we will need to do is restore, as I say, what's called the Convention of the Estates, and that's what Liberation.Scot is doing, which is part of Salvo. That restores a part that would be what you're calling just now, Fiona, probably the Constitutional Convention. But it would involve representatives from the people, but we're not talking particularly MPs or stuff like that. We're talking actually people. They would have the powers under Scotland's constitutional rights to call something like a referendum or a plebiscite or something of that ilk, and it would be legal and above board and all the rest of it. So that's basically where we're going with this.
The Convention of the Estates and a constitutional convention, given that neither of them currently exist, might well end up being, one forum potentially. From what I took from listening to the discussion about the constitutional convention, it was very much including civic society and religious bodies and business groups and representatives of the wider bunch. It certainly wasn't just politicians, and it certainly wasn't just elected politicians either. So is there any common ground there, do you think? Could you see Scotland's full range of the independence movement joining up on some kind of common approach?
I would certainly hope so. As I said, Fiona, there's people from different parties working in this, and that's more than anything gives me hope. And again, it is very people-centred. It's not about politicians trying to get seats. It's a whole way around the whole sort of political problem of political parties going, give us seats and then we'll give you your freedom sort of thing, and then it doesn't happen. And this is the people of Scotland turning around, taking their sovereign right and saying, right, this is what we want, and you're going to do it, basically.
You may be surprised at how quickly various bodies like the unions and others would want to be involved and not miss out. You'd maybe get the CBI wanting to be involved, the Federation of Small Business, and there's a host of other organisations like that, that once they see that this thing's up and running and it's got momentum, they're going to want to be in there. And if they know they can join it without having to commit themselves to one side or the other, they may well be happy to do that.
It was Joanna Cherry who spoke for the motion, the Scottish Constitutional Convention. But what struck me about it was that she was proposing, and then it was accepted, that it was that convention that would be empowered to negotiate with Westminster. Obviously, it's not just SNP people who will be in it. And she made a point of saying, whatever MPs want to be on it can be on it, plus Civic Scotland, plus representatives of smaller indie parties who at the moment may or may not have their own representatives actually in Holyrood. And I thought that's a step that needed to be taken.
Joanna's a very wise woman. Let me give you a secret. I don't think I've mentioned this ever before. So here's an exclusive.
An exclusive.
Run up to 2014. Discussions took place. I mean, I was on the advisory board, as you know. Nicola Sturgeon sat next to us. Patrick Harvie was there. Pat Kane, Elaine C. Smith. And I was approached ahead of the referendum by Alex Salmond's team. And they said, look, if we get a majority for independence, then there will need to be a group of us who negotiate what independence means, the assets and liabilities be shared out. That could be a process that could take a couple of years. How much of the London Underground belongs to Scotland? I mean, it was our money that built it as much as others. And it was clear that the Scottish Socialist Party would be part of that negotiating team. And I think that was the right thing to do. Joanna's proposition today, the same theme. It's the same, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We've all got to be part of this. We've all got to sell it. It's one thing to win the referendum. It's another to get an agreement with the negotiations that come out. Since your question was about Joanna's proposition, I'm entirely behind that. That has to be the approach, that we all buy into independence. I've got profound differences with the SNP. I don't support the monarchy. I'm a socialist and not a capitalist. But if we are arguing for independence, we do so on the basis that we can all benefit from this. All the beneficiaries are entitled to be there at the negotiating table saying, this is what we want, so that's important.
Question 4. What should the strategy for the next general election be?
The next election is going to be the general election. First past the post. The argument on the one side is, well, that's how it's run. That's how Labour or the Tories are going to claim a victory in terms of number of seats. We'd be silly to tie ourselves into a situation where we were looking for a majority of votes cast in Scotland. So, but you were saying you thought, okay, it's got to be eventually, at least, I presume you mean, is that it's got to be a majority of votes. I mean, that's really not going to happen in a general election with first past the post, is it?
I don't know. I think it could well. If all of the independence supporting parties put a mandate for independence at the top of their manifestos, then you could very well get a majority of votes when they're all counted together, because it wouldn't just be parties that win seats. Even if a party student didn't win seats, their vote would be counting towards an independence vote. Let's say the SNP win the majority of seats. We've had that plenty of times. In fact, we had 90% back in 2015. If they win a majority of seats, they have every right to push Scotland's case in Westminster, and they've every right to negotiate with whoever the potential Prime Minister is.
Basically, our position on it is that people that are going down to Westminster, we are basically participating in our own gaslighting. It's creating the illusion that we actually have a say in what is going on down there. So the idea is to bring our people back up from there and basically bring the playground back into Scotland and start from that point, that we are not being properly represented. How we appear to the international community really matters as well, Fiona, because I mean they're also under the illusion that we participate in a democracy, and it's not the case. Whereas nobody was in any doubt with the likes of Northern Ireland and what was going on there, that there was a real problem. That was because Sinn Féin chose to abstain. So they knew that there was a real problem going on. We need to be going along the same lines. We also need to stop the gravy train that's going on, because unfortunately, all the people that go down there don't want to come back up.
That seems a very sweeping statement. I mean, what makes you think that, or do you have any particular ones in mind that you think that's the case?
Well, look at the SNP. They had 56 MPs down there in 2015. What did they do with them? What did they achieve? You know, ask yourselves that. And if you can have that number, 56 out of 59, and make no sort of inroads, then what actual use is it?
Yeah, and that may actually say more about the imbalance in Westminster as a whole, because even if they'd had 59 out of 59, still get outvoted. So
yeah,
it's just an inherently unfair system.
It's an inbuilt majority. I mean, we're meant to be in a union of equals, but the other party has got 10 times more MPs than we do.
The main issue next year's general election will be the cost of living crisis. It won't be independence. It won't be Ukraine. It won't be, climate change even. It'll be the cost of living crisis. And therefore, if you're trying to jump on the basis of saying, make independence the issue that people will consider where they're going to place their vote, you've got an uphill struggle, because that's not where their attention is. It's the price of their rent, the price of petrol, the price of things they can no longer easily afford. So I'm sure that was the case in Motherwell last Thursday.
People for a while have been holding their noses and voting SNP because of independence. But the SNP had a chance in 2021 using a PR system to assist smaller independence supporting parties to win seats. But they refused, and they pushed on with the both votes SNP policy. We formed AFI, SNP people and others, because we wanted to max the yes. We wanted to put yes, independence, foremost. Unfortunately, I've got to say this, the SNP put the SNP foremost at the last Scottish election, because by pushing both votes SNP, they got 1 million votes and they got 2 seats. A quarter of that would have given AFI or any other party 20 plus seats, which would have got rid of 20 unionists out of the parliament, and the Tories and Labour and the Lib Dems wouldn't be nearly as strong as they are. But the SNP chose the both votes SNP route. Now, even more bizarrely, the Scottish Independence Convention agreed to write to the SNP before the council elections. And the council elections, as you know, is an STV system where you rank the people you want to get in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's even better. And there's no danger to the biggest party in agreeing that people should vote till they balk, as it was put. But what did the SNP do? Maybe not everywhere, but in a lot of their council areas, they put out leaflets, and I saw them, saying, only vote for your SNP candidates.
Yes.
So vote 1, 2 for the SNP. Do not vote for ISP or Green or Alba in the council elections. Now, that is bizarrely strange, given that it was an STV election.
Yeah.
And I do not understand how any tactician could have seen that as a good way to move. So we've had two examples in recent years where the SNP have made a decision to put the SNP first. I hate saying that because when I joined the SNP in 1965, I joined it to get independence for Scotland. I did not join it to create a political party that would want to stay in power at any cost for its own sake. I would hope maybe as things move on into next year and as we get closer to the general election, that what the SNP might do is obviously continue with the policy they've approved at their conference, but add a wee bit to it and say, but we will also be willing to consider as allies of ours the votes for any party that puts independence as the top priority, to assist us in our argument and debate and discussion with Westminster, that it's not just SNP seats and votes, but it's the others as well. If the SNP even moved that short distance, that would be a huge step forward for them in terms of their own thinking.
You know, I think what you said about, you know, counting all the votes together for whatever spread of independence voting parties, they've all got to count. The risk is that in a first past the post election, even although X thousand people vote for Alba and other, you know, Y thousand vote for Greens and everything, there are constituencies where the SNP have the current MP, but by a very slim majority over Labour. If those people vote for Alba or Green or ISP, great, but those votes don't count in a first past the post, and you end up with the SNP losing MPs at a point where if everyone had just voted SNP, they perhaps wouldn't lose it. So it's just it's this blooming first past the post system. It just makes everything so difficult.
I think what you've just described is the dilemma that has faced a lot of people in the last 9 years, that up until then, if you look back at the SNP and its policies and its conferences and the debates and everything else, there was a big effort in the SNP always to put forward policies that were good for Scotland, but that were broad enough to keep a very wide range of people together. And what you've seen in the last maybe 6 years in particular is a move away from that into adopting policies that are more divisive. And that has given people a real problem. It's the wheesht for Indy thing, I suppose, you know. I think that's why you've seen other parties beginning to develop in the way you have. Yeah. And of course, the unionist vote has been like that for a long time, where you've had Labour, Tory and Lib Dems, whereas everybody, basically 99%, backed the SNP.
If we go down the road of the smaller parties are not big enough to realistically fight for a seat, but they are big enough to lose somebody else's seat, you know, by taking votes from them. So it's all different when it comes to Holyrood and you've got proportional representation. But the other factor in the general election coming up is you're not just asking those people to choose between maybe my vote for Labour or lending my vote for Indy. You're also asking them to choose between, do I want to lend my vote for Indy or do I want to give the Tories a kicking and get them out of Parliament? And I think that might well be the one that wins in the general election that we're just about to have. Different ball game entirely at Holyrood. So what's ISP's thoughts on that general election? Are you intending to stand candidates, even though they won't then, if elected, appear at Westminster?
Yes, we will be standing candidates, because the point of the abstention thing is that we are making the point that the seats are useless, and also to prevent other people from going down there and settling down, as it were. So yes, we want to put a permanent block in that road as well. So, I mean, our initial thoughts when we started were that we weren't going to run with Westminster at all, but unfortunately there's so much attention drawn to it that there has to be some kind of political response to it, so that's what we intend to do.
Question 5. What would be the impact of Labour winning the general election?
I think support for independence is probably still about 45%, but support for the SNP is down about 10 or 12%. So the question is, how can support for the SNP be down 12 and support for independence have remained where it was? And I think you're forced to draw the conclusion that that probably means that a big proportion of those people in Scotland who support independence are thinking of voting Labour. That's where the SNP support has gone. Unfortunately, not yet gone to the SSP. It's not gone to the Greens as far as I can see. So the SNP support seems to be travelling over to the Labour Party, are facing both ways at once. They're trying to ride the horse forwards and backwards simultaneously.
They might hold the balance of power. If Starmer felt that he had to concede something to get power, then they might concede more powers for the Parliament, or they might concede another referendum. It's possible. More powers for the Parliament, it's all very well, but it doesn't overcome the biggest problem for us, and that is that the powers of the Parliament can be whipped away.
I think what's happening is that people are disengaging from political parties, but they're getting more involved in political movements. I find it interesting to look at what's happening just now and compare it with what was happening in Ireland, maybe in the sort of late 1800s, where you had things like the Land League, for example, which was a huge movement about exactly what's happening in Scotland, about land and the ownership of land and what it was being used for, because it is being squandered a lot, in terms, and it's been used badly in terms of the environment and so on. You've got issues like, well, one of the things I mentioned earlier is free ports. So we're very much getting involved in that, because that is huge implications, both in terms of it's really effectively an annexation of land in Scotland and bringing it under completely different laws. It's absolutely gobsmacking when you look at the potential effects of it. I mean, it's a very big issue for where I'm from, Fiona, because to come back to Jim Ratcliffe, he bought up lots and lots of fracking licences, and they attempted to come and frack down our way at Cumbernauld, at Deerdykes, and it was actually the local council. I was one of the council at the time that chased them off, also to give them their due. Scottish Water, who owned the land that they were drilling on. But effectively what free ports are going to do is they're going to take away those powers from local government and hand them to the free ports.
We can guess that it's going to be a Labour government in Westminster whenever they have the election, whether it's May, October or Christmas Day, whenever it is. Do you think that is going to make any difference to how we approach the independence question at all? Do you think there's any glimmer of hope with it being a Labour government?
I think the one thing that it might do, at least it will settle the question in everyone's mind of whether or not a Labour government's going to be better. I think it's worth bearing in mind as well, at least a third of the people in the Labour movement actually support independence. And I think there could be increasing pressure, if not to actively support independence, at least not actively oppose it. It's a very, very fluid situation just now, Fiona.
My take on it is that the principal support for Labour is an anti-Tory vote. Not pro-Starmer, it's not pro-Anna Sarwar or Jackie Baillie. It's people are sick to the back teeth of the cost of living crisis that they attribute to the Tories. They've been in for 14 years. Behaviour of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss as individuals, I mean, they represent what the Conservative Party is. They were the Prime Ministers. And the record was so disgraceful that they gave all politics a bad name. So I think the Tories are absolutely heading for a doon, as we say in the west of Scotland where I grew up, next year. That's very much a mixed blessing, because we're heading for the most right-wing Labour government in my lifetime.
These by-elections that have happened, seems that it's the SNP vote, it's staying at home. The Labour numbers in the votes, they're getting a much bigger percentage of the vote, but the actual numbers of votes being cast isn't shifting very much. And I mean, you have to give them credit because they've got their vote out and the SNP didn't get theirs out. But it looks like it's I'm just staying at home, I'm not going to do it. I mean, maybe that
Yeah.
would be different if when there comes to an actual election than an actual, campaign that's going. But
I don't know, it's a good point. I mean, when you consider, Rutherglen, there was a by-election in my hometown of Motherwell last Thursday, and what was significant wasn't the result, meaningless. What was significant is the turnout was just 20%. The turnout, I mean, the three of us went through the referendum where the interest in politics was sky high. We had 80% turnout in that referendum. What's happened is interest in politics is greatly diminished. In a by-election in Motherwell, a place like Motherwell, as if Motherwell hasn't got enough problems to get people up and at them about. Yet only 20% of people vote in a council election. The turnout in Rutherglen, again, was terrible.
yeah,
And it's a reflection of those people. Often they're the poorest. They're the most divorced from politics. They don't follow it particularly well. They know, that they just feel as if they're getting constantly pressed upon. Their standard of living is getting worse and worse. And they just walk away because they don't have any faith in any of the political parties to do it. And I think that's principally what the SNP are suffering from. Not just that people have gone to Labour, a proportion have transferred to Labour, a bigger proportion of our support have lost all faith in them, not turning out at all.
The recent poll that's got us all jumping, where we've got 54% for independence, which is wonderful. We don't have 54% of voters proposing to support independent supporting parties. So that must be made up of people who have said, yes, I'm going to vote Labour or less likely Tory, but who would also want independence. So in an election where it's based on what does your manifesto say about independence, if you're a Labour supporting, Indy supporting person, what do you do? Because we have to get them to vote for a party they don't want to vote for in order to come under that mandate.
I think the only way to get them in is for the SNP to adopt an unequivocal statement about independence and the majority of votes, and for all the other Indy supporting parties to do the same and push that point really hard during the UK general election campaign and subsequent Scottish ones if necessary, so that Labour voters would know that if they want independence, they would have to vote for one of the Indy parties, not necessarily the SNP, any of them. There might be others that were more amenable to them if they want independence, but they'd be doing it as a one-off to get over the independence line. And then they could revert to Labour once we are independent.
if you're a Labour member, or at least a Labour voter, and it's always been the case, whether you're prepared to put your wish for independence top of your list. And, I mean, basically, if someone wants independence, but they keep on voting Labour, well, they're not putting it at top of their list.
Last question. What do we do now? What's our next steps?
But I'm optimistic that it's possible to get to 60. It's not beyond us. It's not, it's not flights of fancy or anything like this, So that discussion we had about what might or might not be in a constitution and the Constitutional Convention, married together with this sense that you can trust. Trust in politics is a really, really important thing, And so when you look at the question of land reform or the housing inequities in Scotland, there's so many of the other inequalities that are there. This isn't new. We've been saying we need land reform for 50, 60 years. The crofters unions were arguing for this in the 20s. And we've been talking about the need for, affordable housing in Scotland for the last 40 years. So you then draw the conclusion, so what's stopping it? What's the actual vested interests that are clearly powerful enough to say, nope, that's no happening? One of the obvious problems you've got in building 100,000, they used to be called council housing, now we refer to them as social housing for rent that people can afford, that are proper quality is. Those people living in a £400,000 house in Edinburgh are not going to be very happy if all of a sudden that reduces itself to 200,000. Because there's so many tens of thousands of other cheaper houses on the market. Because we know fine well, there's where the resistance lies in part. People have to work out who can you trust to challenge and defeat the vested interests. What drives me as a socialist is Need is more important than profit.
Well, at the moment, I mean, this is what Liberation.Scot is doing. It's bringing people together that will form, as it were, a sort of congress, if you like. That was what the Stirling Directive was about, where we handed over a statement saying that we, the sovereign people, were instructing our MPs and MSPs and stuff to start preparing Scotland for independence, and if they weren't doing it, then after a certain date, then we would take it into our own hands.
What was that date?
They've got until the 22nd of December, and then after that, it's going to get interesting.
Oh goodness, I hadn't picked up on that at all. That sounds really interesting. Can you tell us any more?
I think I need to be careful what I'm saying just now.
Can I ask a bit about just what happened with Ash Regan, or trying to get a bill in to hold a referendum on our right to have a referendum, I think is my reading of it. Alex Salmond had said at the press conference that launched it that this had been his plan all along for if Cameron had refused the Section 30 back in 2014.
Taking such a bill into the Scottish Parliament forces all of the parties and all of the MSPs to put their views on the line when they vote and when they debate. It would force all the parties to be very clear whether they actually accepted the claim of right, whether they would accept the right of the Scottish people to have a say, their own say in their own future. So I would see it more as something to force the issue, to bring it up full frontal. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how the vote would go on something like that.
Yeah, it would. But then say it's overwhelmingly passed. Where does that get us? It's not going to hold any weight in terms of Westminster agreeing that we can do that. I mean, perhaps it makes it harder for them to continue to refuse a referendum, perhaps.
What things like that do is it adds to the pressure, it raises the profile, it brings to the attention of the Scottish people something that the media can't ignore. It brings it out so people can see that a vote of the Scottish Parliament with 60% support, let's say, is ignored by London. And that adds grist to the mill for the cause of independence. It's good politics. See, politics isn't all about just winning a vote and doing something. Politics is about the build-up. It's about profile. It's about getting out there and letting people know what you're about. And all of these things add pressure. You have a general election, Scottish or UK, and you win your 55% of the vote, and you go to the international community, you can show that the Scottish Parliament itself in 2024 voted in favour of the folk having the right to choose. So it's another nail in the coffin of unionism, if you like. It's another weight on the scales in your favour, as you put it yourself, Marlene, you know. So the whole essence of what we tried to do with our route to Indy and Christians for Indy is unity and pulling people together, trying to help to get people to talk to each other. Because that's one of the basic essences of being a Christian, you know, is love the Lord, obviously, but love your neighbours like yourselves, and certainly folk that have the same aim as you, to get together and work together and stop the nasty bickering and the criticism of each other and try and pull it together. I know that's very, very difficult in politics.
This year's difficult for the independence movement because Labour's going to get in and people say I'm voting Labour to get rid of the Tories, and therefore if Labour's not in favour of independence, well, that's just tough, etc. But I think this is a crisis Labour government, virtually from day one. Here's Stammer's economic policies and the state of the economy he'll do nothing about, which leads to big social convulsions. His policy in Ukraine is all over the place. His policy in climate change is not to be trusted, etc. And I think what we may well see is the next year might be difficult for the independence movement. The general election, as I say, that the polls would lead you to believe the SNP may lose half their seats in Scotland. But that Labour government is in a crisis, and as you said, so many of the problems that we then say are real to us, whether it's about Trident on the Clyde or land reform or reform of the council tax or the standard of living, etc. Labour will do nothing for working people on that. And so what's your choice? That we have to, expect the Tories to get back in? No, in Scotland, we've got the national question. That's the route for us. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, there's Lenin there, a pamphlet called 2 Steps Backward, 1 Step Forward. And that's what I look at. 2 steps backward to a Labour government, it's a waste of time. You get rid of the Tories, but their opponents of independence, died in the wool unionists. But they're in crisis, and working people in Scotland facing the crisis won't be saying, well, what we're going to do, wait till somebody else gets elected at Westminster? That's a non-event. What, we're going to wait in the Labour left? Somebody like Corbyn or something? I mean, Keir Starmer has essentially gutted the Labour Party of left-wingers. Diane Abbott's effectively expelled. Jeremy Corbyn's expelled. So the idea that you'd wait for some kind of socialist Labour government is, I'm afraid, dead in the water. So what my conclusion is that I'm not so much pessimistic or optimistic, but I think the route to independence might be more difficult in the beginning and more profitable and more likely to get an echo later on, 2025, 2026, when the Scottish Parliament elections. There's a platform that says, Holyrood, now we're confident we've got the majority of people in Scotland want independence. We've demonstrated it in 2026 by electing SSP MSPs, Green MSPs, Scottish Socialist Party MSPs, Alba, whoever. And then we say we're taking that democratic majority case to a Labour government. And dare ye to say that the democratic will of the Scottish people cannot be achieved if we want independence. So it's a happy ending, at least it's a miserable beginning.
That's the most optimistic view of it we've had. That's brilliant.
And big thanks to all our guests for joining us.
We've done those 3 programmes now, Fiona, and I have appreciated, well, first of all, getting my head around what the SNP came up with. I really appreciated hearing from those 3 SNP members we talked to, because they're all very active within the SNP. And then this one now, well, in a way, coming in from different angles. I'm not sure that there's a huge difference, though.
The details, the differences. But even having heard from all of the SNP to really go into it in depth from a wide range of other people, I'm left thinking, who knows what's going to happen? Because so much of it isn't within our control anyway. It depends when general elections are called. It depends how well Labour do. There's so many variables. But the one person whose comments left me feeling, oh, this is going to be all right, was Colin Fox right at the end. In fact, I think he was quoting Lenin, wasn't he? You might go a couple of steps backwards, but then you're going to move forward. And that, I think, it is something to hold on to in all the uncertainty, that although we don't really know exactly how it's going to pan out, we are still moving forward. And as we're recording this, support for Indy is at 54%. So by no means is this game over.
Yeah, exactly. And we hope you've enjoyed the series.
And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll put the links to parts 1 and 2 of this little series in the notes. Don't forget, we'll be back again on Friday. Catch you later. Bye now.